Yeah, let me. Krishnan, are you able to mute? Okay, he's muted now.
Yeah, I'm muted.
Yeah. Is this unit, whatever that is unmuted?
All right. So I think.
As I had called in.
Are you able to hear us at all on Zoom? It looks like the microphone's picking up sound. Okay, good.
Okay, I'll be speaking into the microphone and my laptop, which seems to be working. Okay, sorry about that. So let me put away the chat. So the question that arises next is, well, what company should be providing broadband? I'll be talking particularly about an issue that has been a big philosophical debate, namely, we got this company that some guy who you might have heard of called Elon Musk has some connection to, he has some involvement with government, so I heard, and so, wow, what's the relationship between company and this particular problem in that? And what should be the role of government more generally? Should it be just to provide subsidies? Should it be to do other enabling actions in that? Should it be a one-time engagement? Should it be a continuing engagement in that? And then the underlying fundamental question, when you design a government program in general, and that may not always be the guiding light necessarily in all cases, but traditional good government notions are you want to make a program efficient and effective. Not just the lowest cost, but meet a defined goal that you can quantify. As in, you should be able to tell whether you reach that particular goal in that, how close you are, given that you're never going to completely succeed in that. Okay. Oops. So it turns out that a related problem is not all that new. 100 years ago, roughly speaking, the United States, had a very similar problem, namely for electricity. So in the early 1920s, it turns out that we had a stark urban-rural divide. Large cities, I suspect, including Baltimore, had utility electricity pretty much universally. I'm sure not everybody who was particularly low income could afford it, but generally you could get electric service, utility electric service for lights and other things if you were living in a city. And in some states that were successful in that, you had it, even though it really had only been 30 years at the time since the technology had been developed. Very similar in terms of timeline from the early days of the internet to, like if you take that as the 1990s, roughly by 2010, most of us probably had pretty decent internet service in that. But in the 1920s, a tiny fraction of farms in rural areas had electric service in that. And indeed, even 15 years later, only about a tenth of US farms had central station, meaning not just a steam engine with a generator locally, or maybe some small water wheel or something, but real electricity, if you like, and that. And then a foundational government effort was made under Roosevelt administration in part of a New Deal efforts, where you had the Rural Electrification Act. And it did really three things in that. Namely, it made money available, loans largely, but also grants from what I understand in that. It made expertise available, and I'll talk about that in a minute. That's quite important. And it created structures. Namely, it created structures that turned out, even though nobody could anticipate that 100 years ago, namely, it created the rural electric cooperatives. So those are nonprofit organizations that provide electric service to about 10% of the population, households in the US today. They're cooperatives, as in they're owned by the members. They're not shareholders owned, they're member owned. They're nonprofits in that they plow the money back into infrastructure. They're distribution only. They don't generate electricity. They distribute electricity to their rural members. Many of these same rural electric cooperatives, as it turned out, now are also not so much in Maryland, but in other parts of the country are significant contributors to broadband deployment, because it turns out that poles and people who can climb poles are two key ingredients for providing broadband service, not just electric service. One of the other interesting things, which is also relevant to today, is that the REA, the Rural Electrification Authority, which became part of the US Department of Agriculture, was able to dramatically reduce the cost of deployment by simply doing a much better job of mechanizing and rationalizing the deployment one. One of the sad parts, however, on the other side is it turns out, and for those of you or for us who care about infrastructure, is that our ability to deploy infrastructure has not actually gotten all that much better in 100 years. So one of the interesting statistics I read was that they were able to dramatically, reduce a third the cost of deploying a mile of rural electric lines. Again, they didn't have poles at the time. There's nothing there by definition in that. And so that translates in it's actually, for whatever reason, that didn't get updated. In 2025, that translates into about $20,000 in deployment cost in that, which unfortunately turns out it was cheaper in the 1930s to go through unexplored, no infrastructure at all territory than it is now to build a mile of fiber, which costs between $25,000 and $50,000. So we have not, in a century, made any significant progress in the physical civil engineering deployment model, and for a variety of reasons that would be interesting to discuss, particularly for civil engineers. We all bemoan that when we read about why it costs billions of dollars to build a mile of subway in New York or something like that, even though we probably did this much cheaper when the subway was first built. So the idea, so by the way, we had a discussion on that in one of my meetings just earlier today, is somebody asked as to how would we solve the problem? My flippant answer is we need to have much more involvement in robotics and other techniques to make the deployment of physical infrastructure much more efficient than just worrying about deploying code. But separate discussion, separate topic. One of the other topics to note is that the notion of bringing telecommunication services to rural areas is as old as the telephone network. So starting in the early 1900s, when telephone service had been available, again, to urban areas for quite a while, the whole formation of AT&T, and I'm grossly simplifying the history here, but was predicated on this notion is one country, one service, namely AT&T, as promoting the notion that they could provide what became known as universal service. Everybody could get telephone service. Now, again, this didn't happen in the early 1900s. It took quite a while before that was the case. The model that they used was internal cross-subsidization. Namely, as a business user or as a Baltimore resident, you would pay much more than it would actually cost to make a long-distance call, for example, or to call indirectly a rural location. That would be paid at a much higher rate than it would be paid to an urban location. And so your high cost for long distance or for just telephone service was internally subsidizing the low density areas in your state or in the US, broadly speaking. That model was one of the unintended, I suspect, consequences of the breakup of AT&T in 1984 and the Telecommunications Act in 1996 was that model was no longer sustainable. So the same model, by the way, that subsidized Bell Labs was, nobody told telephone users that, but it was basically you paying a tax to support the research excellence of Bell Labs because we allow them to retain and spend those monopoly profits on a generally valuable function that doesn't just engineer telephone switches, but that actually gets Nobel Prizes for background radiation in the universe. So that 1984, 1996 with deregulation and competition, and this is not just a US thing, almost every country ran into versions or had versions of that. Your comment, yes.
Maybe the orthogonal way, which is, they get a monopoly, and in exchange to that, they have to connect everybody.
Yes.
So that's the way I would look at it from the perspective of the American.
Yes. That was certain.
Fair government. We give you a monopoly, AT&T, and you to connect everybody involved, no matter what they are.
Yes. And so it's a.
They take the good deal or not, but if they take the deal, then maybe what you said is from their perspective, they'll subsidize, the easy guys, we get Baltimore connected, that's cheap, relatively speaking, because the density, and we pay more for the other things. But from our perspective, the American people, we gave them a monopoly.
Yes. It was, on the telephone side, it was a little more complicated than that because, and this plays a role even today, that the US is quite, so that was true in most countries where you had the PTT, the Post Telegraph and a telephone company do exactly what you said. We have in that case, actually state-run monopoly that serves everybody. And the US always has had a dominant, particularly long distance company, AT&T, that provided through the Bell companies, local service.
It is exactly.
Yeah, but before that, we've had literally thousands of small rural telephone companies. Yes, they have existed from the very beginning, and there was an explicit mechanism called the intercarrier compensation, where by regulatory fiat, the small company was able to charge like more than, in some cases, was more than $1 a minute, even in relatively recent times, to AT&T, say, that served Baltimore, the Bell company that before the breakup that served Baltimore, and they were forced by regulatory mandate to that. So it wasn't a monopoly. Again, the US was quite different. But it was a government notion of, yes, we regulate the big companies, primarily the Bell companies and then AT&T, to subsidize the small rural companies, as well as what you described, namely to the extent that the big company was serving the other ones, they had to serve everyone. By the way, this is true for cable franchises. That notion, what you described, is fairly universal. So that model started to break in 1984. It broke completely in 1996 because now you had the ability of companies to serve selectively only people that they like to serve because they were businesses or in dense areas in that. So that model broke. So we'll get to how we can fix that, but let's step back a little bit before we get to the kind of out of a historical sense. Let's talk about broadband a little bit. So the notion has always been that broadband, like electricity, was not just another consumer product. So we can say, okay, we don't subsidize movie theaters, say, just to take another kind of entertainment venue in rural areas, generally speaking, we don't do that. Or we don't subsidize skating rinks or whatever. So they're consumer products, we just assume if you don't get it because the density is not there, that is your problem. And, electricity and broadband have always had this notion that besides the individual entertainment benefit that you might get out of that there are societally valuable things like employment, health, education that are facilitated by the access to the internet. I'm not going to, in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through those, but there's some reasonably good evidence, and COVID brought this really home, and this is how we got to where we are today, that it's really hard to do remote work. It's hard to visit a doctor that you can't see in person, or go to school or university or community college if you don't have high quality internet access, okay? So all these functions that we care about as a society, as opposed to just personally, are really only enabled by high quality, high speed internet access in that. So, but then we need to define, like I said, is what are we talking about here? And one of the interesting things that makes the US and countries different, and I'm going to just briefly talk on that, it deserves a lot longer discussion, is that if you look at the OECD countries, so kind of the high income countries in the world, you'll see that there's quite a bit of difference regardless of income. It's not explained by how rich that country is as to what kind of technology they have. So you see the dark blue bars or black bars are fiber, the light blue bars are DSL, so like kind of legacy technology, and the diamonds are cable. And so what you'll see in short is, for reasons that are historical and that have to do with all kinds of things other than broadband, some countries have a large number of people that have cable access, and initially for cable TV, developed in the 1980s, typically for cable TV, and now use that for internet access. Others are DSL dominated, others have become fiber dominated. Again, it's a historical artifact. The US happens to be one of those countries that has a very large cable access, which turns out to be both lucky, in the sense that even though it was deployed for accessing movie channels, that this is perfectly situated for providing high-speed internet access. Indeed, that's probably by far the dominant technology across both urban and rural areas in Maryland, for example. But it also means that the incentive to deploy fiber is much less than it is in countries that have only DSL, for example. So just as a kind of historical background, for those of you who are not kind of in the networking side, all of our broadband access technologies, with the exception of the most recent satellites, were originally designed for something else. So DSL came out of a notion that you can reuse the telephone cable for relatively speaking at the time, high-speed internet access starting in the late 1980s in that, and culminating roughly in 2000 when you had kind of a development largely was completed on that. And in cable, starting again in the 1990s, where in the early 2000s, we got to about 80% of a population that was subscribed to not just access, which is somewhat larger, have a household had cable access in that. And it turned out that with relatively simple upgrades that did not require upgrading the field infrastructure, just the electronics on both sides, you could provide very good internet quality on the cable side, while DSL essentially topped out in the early 2000s, as in the speed that you could have. The deployment of these technologies is largely driven by linear density, namely how many households can you support on that particular on that technology? Because you can think of the cost to first approximation as the distance between me and my neighbor is what I'm responsible for, so to say, in terms of the company's perspective, for covering in terms of investment. So if there's a mile between me and the next house, somebody has to pay for that mile of fiber, cable, whatever it happens to be. Again, leaving wireless technologies aside for a moment in that. So that means, what I said earlier is if that costs $20,000, $50,000, my house now costs the cable company, the fiber company, that much money. So that means the density that you can support in a particular technology is economically limited. It's not technically limited as much, it's economically limited. And the density in the US, and that makes the US quite different from many other countries, varies by several orders of magnitude. So most people don't just live randomly strewn across the landscape by what you might imagine by just looking at population density. Leaving Alaska aside for a moment, that's a little different. But in most cases, people, even in rural areas, live along roads. People like to drive or have to drive to a grocery store. So, but the density differs between anywhere realistically like 1 mile on average between households, and in Manhattan, it's up to 1,500 households per road mile because much of it is vertical. So how do we define within that, now that we know that we have these different technologies, they have different deployment characteristics, how do we define that? So the US government, the Congress defined reliable broadband technology as for the first time as this notion that it had a relatively soft criteria, that it meets performance criteria for service availability, adaptability, so future-proofing in that. And in the initial version of that, reliable broadband technology was defined as basically fiber, cable modem, digital subscriber line, which was essentially nobody deploys DSL to new places anymore, or terrestrial fixed wireless. That changed, as we will see along the way. So how do we define what the high-speed technology is? Well, we define it, the Federal Communications Commission has had a definition where if it's below that threshold, it's bad, above good. And that has changed every 5 to 10 years. So in 1996, we started at 200 kilobits, which was the early DSL days. And then in 2024, it was updated to be 100 megabits download and 20 megabits upload. Now, the definition is not so much based on just need. It is based on essentially what industry could support. So the definition behind, nobody said that outright, but that's pretty much what happened, is you could not define a threshold where 50% of the US did not have access to that. So you defined it in a way that almost everybody already had it, and you only had a manageable number of people who didn't have it. So for example, even in 2015, 25 megabits was hardly kind of a state of the art. So what happened more recently is, well, the world is a little bit more gray shaded as opposed to just good, bad. So they defined that there are 3 categories of people, of households, and not namely the lucky ones. They're considered served. So 100 megabits down, 20, that threshold in there. So that was considered served. So basically, if you had fiber, cable, service, you were done, some fixed wireless as well. Then you were in that gray area where you were underserved, as in you had some internet access, often DSL, but you had below 100, but above 25, and then you were unserved if you were below that. And there was a latency requirement, which basically meant that geostationary satellites, in particular, just by the physics of it, they have a latency of about 600, 700 milliseconds, not suitable for interactive applications like Zoom. And so you have they were excluded, even though they provide coverage to the whole country pretty much. So eligible for funding were locations that were in those lower two categories. But speed is not the only category. I won't go through all of that. It is not just upload, download speed. Increasingly, it's upload speed because people like to upload videos and not wait for half an hour for that. How variable is the speed? Does it change over the day or not? What's the latency, the delay that you encounter? And importantly, what's the reliability of that particular service? Does it fail? Either longer term, many rural access, one of the big problems wasn't that it was slow, that it would have, because it was relying on ancient copper lines that were badly maintained, you would routinely have week-long outages before somebody could be bothered to fix that line in there somewhere, because the phone company no longer really cared, among other things, and sometimes just hard, remote areas, all of that. So you want reliability that's closer to what's called measured by nines, so 99.5% of the time you want access. That's actually not that great. It's 2 days a year of outages, more than we like, but that's the threshold that was chosen in that. Indeed, you can capture some of these things. The FCC has instituted a broadband label. This is my consumer advisory for today, that actually tells you what the real cost is after all the initial teaser rates expire, and gives you some of the network characteristics in that. It's not perfect, but it looks much more like a nutrition label you find on a cereal box, and it provides a version of that for broadband. But I missed from a broader public policy perspective, a notion that has become a dominant part of a discussion. Not just what's your individual speed, but does it scale? Namely, a network can't just, it's easy for a network that has one user to support whatever speed the physics will allow, electronics will allow. The hard part for many technologies, since they're all shared at some level between users, is, and this is true for fiber all the way to wireless and satellite, how much data can collectively be supported on that network. It turns out that for many years, and this is Comcast's measurement, they're kind enough to publish those over the years, this has been rising at about 35% a year in that, pretty consistently. COVID, you see the COVID bump in there, where that rose quite dramatically, but even if you just kind of average it, it's that. So that roughly means that we have to support about 5 megabits per second per subscriber, not per active user. They get 100 megabits instantaneously, but not all the time, in order to do that. So if you develop like a wireless network, the problem is often not the top speed that you can measure. 5G can easily provide more than 100 megabits. It's just when you have 100 users on that cell tower, can they get 500 megabits in total? So let's look at who does and does not have access. This is a global map, just to give you perspective, and it's roughly in North America, 97% have access, but that does not distinguish between home access and mobile access. So when you talk about internet adoption, it usually combines the two, because in most lower income countries, mobile is by far the dominant technology. We look at home broadband use in that. We are down to, that's about 80% of households have access, but it is largely, leaving the rural-urban divide aside, it is an income issue. So we see a stark divide that home internet access is essentially a middle class and above purchase. Many low-income households, only about half of low-income households subscribe to home internet. So why do we care about home internet? Because many of the more productive things that people do, not just scrolling on TikTok, that you can do on your phone quite well, is only really usable like telehealth, like doing homework, participating in job is really only feasible on a home internet connection on a real PC step device, So let's get to the why part. And I'm going to be focusing on one aspect on it, but I do want to highlight that this is really more complicated than that. Traditionally, we have looked at 3 reasons why we are at 80% or at 50%, depending on the income level. Namely, is broadband available in your home? How to do that without moving if it's not there? Increasingly, is it affordable? Can you actually spend $60, $80, $120 a month on that particular service? And assuming those two are true, do you actually want it? Some population groups, typically this is more for older and low education attainment type of population, it just doesn't seem all that relevant. They don't need remote work because they have a job that requires physical presence. They may not need these other services. So there's some group that just, for reasons good or bad, just doesn't want or need it. So indeed, as an aside, the US government tried for about 2 years, ran a pretty massive experiment that was used to subsidize internet access for low-income households. Who has heard of ACP here, Affordable? No, okay. So there was a program that started just after COVID, replacing a COVID-era program, where there was essentially a SNAP food stamp model for internet access. As in, if you participated in one of those low-income programs, subsidy programs, such as food stamps, or Medicaid in particular, those were 2 bigger ones that drove enrollment, you could get a $30 subsidy, and it turned out that many of the service providers offered a $30 service so that low-income households could get free internet access at home, or in some cases, they would subscribe to an enhanced mobile service beyond the Obama phone lifeline type that some of you have heard of, where you can get a very basic voice and data service on your phone if you're low income. And it was quite successful. About 23 million households enrolled out of 129 million households. Eligibility was quite generous, roughly whatever, 30% or so, 25% of the US household would have been eligible for that. As usual, not everybody does it. Okay, so that program was Congress, Republican majority at the time, did not renew that program. So we have now no subsidies except in some states. New York State, for example, has a version of that. Let me just skip that. One just geographic kind of lesson that's interesting is, why is this problem particularly hard in the United States? Now, this problem exists in almost every country, even high-income country in that. The short version is the US population, unlike Canada and Australia, which obviously also have low population density overall, relatively speaking, is much more distributed. In Canada, everybody lives within 100 miles of a border, and in Australia, everybody lives around the coast areas or certain coastal areas. So you can reach almost everybody by just serving that strip or that coast, and you're done. In the US, people are much more distributed than the other countries. So how do we know where broadband is available? Well, we didn't. Until about 2021 and 2022, we had no real idea. We don't have a perfect idea right now, but we have a better idea. So the FCC, with a contractor, did 2 things. It created a map of every single household and single building that could get internet access, and you can look at that map. So you can type in your address and you can find out which service providers offer what top speed at your location. And it turns out so that, for example, in this particular one, you can see it here, the boundary, about and 90% for any technology, this is barely read it there, have access to 250, so well underserved category. Well, if you now look at the more restricted technologies such as wired and cable and fiber and so on, we're now getting a gap. These technologies fill roughly 7 to 10% of people in the US don't have access to that at the location level. So this is self-declared data by the providers. We can discuss how accurate that is. We'll take a longer discussion than I have time for here. So, and if you look at urban versus rural areas, the difference becomes even more pronounced. Namely, you have about 30% at the higher speed or 20% at the higher speeds in urban rural areas that don't have access. One of the other interesting things that has happened is that traditionally availability for technology increases over time. Right? More people get access to computers, to cell phones, to 5G, to AI, you name it, in that. Broadband is one of the few technologies where technologies disappear. In particular, DSL, as you can see in that blue line there, started to disappear, which meant that because it was the technology of availability, not choice, for many rural areas, suddenly many rural areas had lost their access simply because the telephone company decided they were no longer wanted to support DSL for a variety of reasons. Availability is also one that is highly localized. So this is from Cumberland, Maryland here. So this is the green dots are the areas where you have 100 megabits above terrestrial available, and the red dots are where it's not available. So you can see this is not like nobody has it. It is the more outlying, or in some cases not even obvious why this location has it and that location doesn't. In that, I mean, it's not like the cable is going to skip over that location. So maybe it does after all, so who knows? But it's a much more diverse, particularly in East Coast states. We're not talking about like whole areas that don't have access. Right, well, I skip this. So the US government has been involved in broadband deployment for many years, with literally dozens of programs that have tried to solve that problem. As an aside, there's always been this urban-rural division, just like we have crop subsidies and SNAP and food stamps in that are essentially political trade-off perceived to be between the urban poor and the rural farmers. We have versions of that. So we have subsidized what are perceived to be, well, that's not really true anymore, low income perceived to be rural urban customers and the rural broadband service providers. So this is done through Universal Service Fund, which you pay for in your telephone, on your mobile bill. Presumably you don't have landline anymore. You pay a significant chunk a few dollars every month to the Universal Service Fund, which subsidizes all of that through the FCC. But there are many other federal government agencies. Turned out broadband deployment is a popular cause. So the US Department of Treasury ran a fairly successful program of about $10 billion. NTIA, the one that I'll be talking about, ran one. US Department of Agriculture and the FCC all run multi-billion-dollar subsidy programs. Those subsidy programs evolved over time. Namely, we started with cost subsidies. I mentioned that. It was allocated to the incumbent local exchange carrier, think telephone company, initially. Then it moved to an auction model, kind of the lowest bidder in that. Then it moved to the every location model. Maybe we now move under the new administration to the, well, you already have Starlink, so why do we need subsidies? one of the problems that we've had is that just because you do the subsidy doesn't always mean that it gets deployed. So just as a kind of illustration of the difficulty that you have when you run these programs, there was a program under the first Trump administration called OutOff, Digital Opportunity Fund, that would to spend roughly $10 billion on that. Roughly 36% of those locations, the provider has reneged on their commitment. They've simply walked away from it and said, sorry, I'm not taking a subsidy, but I'm not providing service either. So those locations obviously couldn't get any other programs either, depending on where that is. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the BEAD program. I'm running short on time here. What happened was that we had a fundamental, even though broadband deployment subsidy is not new, we had a fundamental shift of notion. So kind of so BEAD was the program that was done under the Biden administration to bring broadband to every household. Prior to that, it was let's reduce the number of locations that don't have internet. There was never a notion that everybody would get access. Now it was the explicit goal, 100%, no rounding, exactly every single household and small business in the US should get access, regardless of what it takes. That's a much more ambitious and as a much more difficult goal to do. The old model was we give you a bunch of locations, a bunch of areas in the old days, and you can bid on those, and we'll take the lowest cost of the higher cost location. To do that, now we have to get proposals for every single location under almost all circumstances. In the old world, it was typically the legacy technologies and legacy providers that come in. The telephone company, the cable companies, maybe sometimes in the early days, it was really only the telephone companies. And they could offer DSL in the early days. They could offer fixed wireless, fiber, whatever. Originally, the notion was, indeed, it was largely going to be fiber with a tail end of LEO provision where that fiber just wasn't physically or logistically or financially feasible in that. And it was an allocation per location grouped into project areas. And this was part of, like I said, a $42 billion program. So the largest by far broadband deployment program ever, was part of a suite of programs that was much smaller but important. But we also had as you may have heard, we've had a change of administration sometime this year. And so I like to distinguish when we talk about broadband deployment, kind of BEAD classic and new BEAD for that. And while the name is the same, it has changed pretty significantly. Under the original version of it, affordability was one of the primary criteria. The notion was building something that consumers pay for, but they don't have money to pay for it, is not very sensible. And why build broadband and then people can't actually afford to subscribe to it, given that we particularly don't have subsidy programs anymore. Under the new rules, affordability was a forbidden criteria, one of those new forbidden words. And so you couldn't take into account that how much a provider would charge. That differed from earlier broadband programs, but we'll leave that aside for a moment. So affordability was no longer a consideration. It was really just based on whatever the provider thought they could get away with. There was a notion under the old program that you had to have a low-cost option for low-income consumers besides general affordability based on the notion that you had a subsidy program early on. Now that is essentially a meaningless requirement. You have to have something, but it can be the same price essentially as your regular offer in that. The notion was fiber in the old program, fiber is the long-term technology. Now we don't have that anymore. And it was largely left to the states to decide how much money to spend, subject to the budget allocation. That is no longer true. So let's talk about Starlink before I run out of time. So the big issue and a quite legitimate question is between kind of the early 2020s and now we have a much better option that brings broadband to, in principle, every geographic location in and of itself, because the satellites, Starlink satellites cover that. Just to give you an example, for those of you who've not followed that closely, Starlink consists of a set of satellites that communicate with ground stations by wireless, obviously not laser or anything. They have, not particularly relevant, they have inter-satellite laser links and then communicate with a Starlink antenna over 2 frequency bands in the multi-gigahertz range in that. Okay? Starlink right now in the US has about 1% of the US households, very small fraction, even though it gets a lot more coverage than that. If you're curious about it, you can track the location of satellites on a map, really cool animation. Well, one of the problems with satellite internet access is the cost to the consumer. Right now, it costs about twice as much on average as normal broadband access does. So the question from a subsidy perspective is, do you take that into account that you're shifting a lot of a burden if you rely on that to the consumer? We also ended up with a conundrum. Namely, under the rules is if a location is only served, and almost every location is claimed to be served by Starlink in the United States, then it is considered an unserved location eligible for a subsidy. Once you apply the subsidy, which essentially means you get a free terminal as a location, magically the same location, even though the broadband quality has not changed any way, magically becomes served. So just adding money to something, it's like going to the doctor and saying, okay, I'll pay you a fee and you get healthy without any treatment whatsoever. Just showing up at the doctor does it. And there's no placebo effect here, even to take into account. So that makes for some odd constructions. One of the difficulties that we have is that fiber and satellite have rather different technical and economic model. So fiber lasts a long time, unless the wind blows it off a pole, 20, 50 years in some cases. There's still fiber up there, original fiber that still works just fine. That was deployed during the early days. Satellites fall out of the sky every 5 years. They don't last that long simply because of atmospheric drag as to where they are. So you have to replace your whole network on average every 5 years. It tends to be asymmetric. You have spectrum limitations, but it gets deployed much faster. Right? And so one of the big questions is, would satellite actually have the capacity to support all of those locations? The answer is, we don't know for sure, but it's somewhat dubious to calculate that. Okay. So let me just go through that. Out of time. I just want to illustrate some of the difficulties that you run into in Maryland in particular, is that many of the locations are nicely situated where you're surrounded by trees. Satellites don't like trees. And not as in they can't, the high frequencies don't penetrate the tree canopy, and they certainly don't penetrate mountains. And many of the areas in Western Maryland, for example, are surrounded by hills. People like to live kind of halfway between where the river or the creek is and the top of a mountain, and hard for radio signals to go through there. So let me skip all of that. So we're running out of time. Okay, whoops. So let me conclude by just giving some, what I might say, lessons learned. What worked well is, this has been really one of the most ambitious rural development programs, even though it didn't get as much coverage as you might see elsewhere since the rural electrification program. It's really been a quite ambitious program for that, as in look to every location. But it's also been good in a number of ways. It, for the first time, took account not just speed, but reliability. there was a lot of attempt to do good data work, on large-scale data work, a lot of GIS support, a lot of support for states to figure out the locations and best bids and all of that. States were given a lot of flexibility, which the FCC previously did not do. I think generally that was a good thing. And affordability was taken into account. But the program, I think in hindsight, also had a number of problems, which are illustrative. I can go through those in more detail in the discussion. Is the big problem, like many of the Biden infrastructure program, they just took too long. That was not just a problem because of a change of administration, which meant many things could be reversed under the new administration. It was a problem that it just, the effort reward ratio, I think in the end, just wasn't that good. Okay, and so, but we also have issues, the attempt to fix those problems, I think have made things even challenger, namely in particular, what I think the long-term issue is going to be that if you ignore affordability, many of the people that will get LEO service, they can already get Starlink or maybe in the future Kuiper today. They have chosen not to do that because they just can't afford $120 a month. And so they won't magically be able to afford it when they get a free terminal, which is only about $300 in that. So basically 3 months or less than 3 months of service. And so they will still be left in the same situation as they were before that. Good. We've had rapid changes in the program, which made it hard to do quality programs. And I think it's a giant giveaway to the LEO providers in general. And the timeframes really became unrealistic. With that, I'll close and take questions. Yes.
I think it's not fair, the statement, because before you had no other option. Like, it doesn't matter how much money you want to pay. There was no way you could get anything.
But
And now, yes, maybe 120 is too much for many people, but there is a difference. You can actually get physically. And so it's a question maybe how you enable it, maybe subsidies, or you can calculate how many people are in that category. And at least you have a way to quantify it immediately. Like it's just a question of immediate decision as opposed to it will take 5 years to install whatever the solution that you pick.
yes.
Right? So for 5 years, you're not going to get it, whatever. That's
So-
the difference, right?
Yeah, so there could be a much, well, if I had an additional hour or so, we could have a much more in-depth discussion as to what would I have done differently in that. And like you said, LEO does fundamentally change the picture in that. And it always was, money is fungible. I would have argued, just to take a short version of that, is yes, instead of spending $50,000 on a fiber location, probably would be better to subsidize low-income consumers to get LEO where that's available. But there was no attempt made to differentiate. It's not, because like I said, because of forest coverage and topography, many of us, and those are exactly the locations that don't have fiber. The reasons that I don't have fiber because they're in the middle of the woods, with lots of rugged terrain around them. That's why it's expensive to run fiber there too, because when the houses are a mile apart. So there was no attempt made to differentiate the locations that are like in Kansas with open sky, where yes, indeed, you really probably should do an income-based subsidy. But it turns out in Kansas, running a location doesn't cost all that much because you just run down the county highway. There are poles along the way, and the houses aren't actually that far apart. It's in Western Maryland, in Montana, in California, in the rural areas in California, they are all wooded or they are mountainous in almost all areas. And so you do have a much harder problem to say, Yep, just subsidize Starlink just because we just don't know, because we didn't have the time and Starlink just declared that they could serve every single location without having to prove that they can actually do that. That's the problem I'm having.
People just know, they planning, they're working on it, but if a lot of folks, they all wanted to go have the service, they don't. They're working on it, we have seen their plans, whether it's Starlink or, Amazon Private. So all of a sudden, if you give them a lot, and say, oh, we all want it, well, they can't, so capacity is.
And then there's the capacity problem, can they actually support? Yes, please.
I have a question. So, we all know that US is preferring a small government, and as the logic you have told today, the public good is inefficiently provided in pure market. So, I want to ask what kind of, and we know that US government is work on lobby groups. So, what kind of resistance you have met when you are proceeding with this project?
Yep. So let me go back to the microphones, but I presume folks can hear. 2 years of a question was, we struggle in the US to provide public goods, and that is often opposition to providing public goods, if I heard you correctly. So what resistance did I or the program experience? It turns out that, to be cynical about it, that subsidies for certain people are actually quite welcome. It is subsidies for other people that are more problematic. And you can substitute whatever, you can interpret that in ways that probably gets you into mental violation of certain DEI prohibitions. So there wasn't really a whole lot, because this was not about green energy or whatever. So there wasn't really a whole lot of pushback. Actually, both Republican states and Democratic states were quite enthusiastic, simply because they were given a lot of discretion to decide what to do. Texas ran, even before, under the old administration, ran a very different program. We could argue how effective it was, would have been, but they ran a very different program than California did, even though both large area states, for example, many of the same challenges. So I don't think there was a whole lot of pushback. There was some, what you might call libertarian leaning ones that had some of the arguments that we are having here in a slightly less sophisticated way, but the notion that everybody should get broadband internet access was generally not that controversial. I would say, Ray, you can correct me here, but generally no. This was one of the few programs that was, relatively speaking, uncontroversial. It turns out that this is also one of those where, as it turned out, even under the old administration, there actually was, for the first time, sufficient amount of money available to solve the problem. We would have been able to solve it and do some other good stuff along the way. This turned out that other programs, like Upper Program and so on, were able to take off a lot of the location off the list. And we had the LEO applications to cut off a tail, so to say, of the really high-cost locations at $100,000 whatever dollars per location. And so we had, this was a program that had a pretty good chance of success. Now, there were still long-term, I didn't talk about this, there are long-term sustainability issues. That one-time subsidies in the most rural areas may not be sufficient to maintain the network. Leaving that aside, there were a real opportunity to get it done. So I don't know, I didn't see a whole lot of pushback. There still is a lot of concern about the data accuracy. Largely because we rely on providers to declare when locations are served. And you can imagine that there are all kinds of strange incentives that if you rely on providers to truthfully declare their service, they have both incentives to under-declare and to over-declare. So a lot of states have concerns that those maps aren't all that accurate, ones that I showed aren't all that accurate still, even after 3 years really of efforts. Any other,
I have to cut this off, but
Yep.
thank you so much. Enjoyed having